Welcome to Wagner III. So we just left you off talking about the production of the opera Tristan und Isolde, finished in 1859. Around that time, Wagner had the opportunity for to produce a new version of Tannhäuser in Paris at the Paris Opera. He revised it to incorporated a ballet in the Act 1. You may recall Parisians require ballet for their opera. It's fairly predictable, I guess, that it was going to be a failure. Wagner was not going to incorporate a ballet in the way that the French wanted it. They liked their ballets in the third act, and or the second act. He insisted that it didn't belong there dramatically. So, not surprisingly, it was pulled after 3 performances. But Wagner's music in Paris did influence some young artists, particularly the poet Charles Baudelaire. And Baudelaire, what so attracted him about Wagner's music was that it was not realistic. It was attempting to express something, the kind of the expression of the unmediated self, the unmediated will, and that's a concept brought from Schopenhauer. And Charles Baudelaire was frustrated with what he regarded as the too realistic portrayal of human emotion and ideas in literature and poetry at the time. He wanted to get at something beyond the real, and Wagner was the perfect model for him. It inspired him. And Baudelaire is indicative of a lot of Wagner's influence over a lot of particularly young artists across Europe and across fields, not just limited to music, not just limited to composers. In any event, that, in terms of, for practical reasons, didn't pan out, but something incredibly important did completely fall into Wagner's lap, and that is the ascendancy in 1864 of King Ludwig II to the throne as King of Bavaria. Ludwig was only 18 years old at the time, but he was obsessed with Wagner and Wagner's music. And he basically offered to put virtually his kingdom at Wagner's disposal. He paid Wagner's debts. He put him up in a house in Switzerland, and he promised to support and underwrite all of Wagner's projects. Wagner couldn't have imagined a better situation. King Ludwig is also sort of the center in some bizarre way. He was regarded as a mad king. He was called Mad King Ludwig. It's not clear whether he was completely crazy or not, but he certainly was eccentric, and he indulged himself. You've certainly seen the picture of his castle, Neuschwanstein, which means New Swan Stone, and it's named after the Swan Knight Lohengrin, and it's decorated with mythological figures from Wagner's opera. The man was truly obsessed with Wagner. Now Wagner, of course, played this up and took advantage. So he was set up in this villa on Lake Lucerne. Wagner, the relationship with Matilda Weinzendorf obviously wasn't going to turn into anything, and Wagner's relationship with his wife Minna was irreconcilable at this point. And he fell in love with, or maybe it was the other way around, or maybe it happened simultaneously, but he quickly moved on to an intense relationship with Cosima von Bülow. She was married to another man, a man who was also a big supporter of Wagner and Wagner's music. He was a conductor. Cosima was also the daughter of Liszt, but she and Wagner essentially developed more than an affair. They essentially moved in together. She bore him 3 children before she was granted a divorce from von Bülow. This would be probably shocking today. It was, you can imagine, extremely shocking in Germany and Switzerland in the 1860s. During this time in Triebschen, where he's starting this family for the first time in his life, really, he's having children, little children, He's very productive. He also develops a close friendship, an intellectual relationship with the young philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is also shared a deep interest in Schopenhauer's work. And his first big book, The Birth of Tragedy, From the Spirit of Music, is part of which is written to actually promote Wagner's music dramas as a true successor to Greek drama. And now, this work is flawed by Nietzsche. Nietzsche was too influenced, I think, by Wagner, and as he matured, he began to distance himself. He also began to see much of the ugly side of Wagner's character. He hated Wagner's anti-Semitism, and he also regarded as his development of the festival theater at Bayreuth, which we're going to learn about in a second. He saw that as actually a betrayal of a lot of the artistic goals and ideals that he had espoused in the 1850s. So speaking of Bayreuth, the town council, Bayreuth is a small town in Bavaria, the town council granted Wagner a tract of land and invited him to build his big dreamed up special festival theater he'd been imagining since the early 1850s. But he had to raise the money himself. So he went all over Europe conducting, developing Wagner societies. King Ludwig probably would, if he had been acting on his own, would have probably given him the money. But Ludwig's finance ministers, you can imagine, were not very happy about him giving all of his money away. So it took a few years and some talking to finally convince King Ludwig to underwrite the project. So he probably paid for most of it. So he built his dream theater, and it's quite different than other theaters in Europe. You can imagine it's Wagner. He's not going to make an opera house just like everybody else's. You can see here on the left that the seating is different. There's no galleries. There is no boxes. Everyone has an equal seat. The audience is, and also he turns off the lights during the production, so you're not there to look at other people. You're there to and see who's there. It's not a social occasion. It's an occasion to experience his drama, and he focuses all your attention on it. He buries his orchestra essentially. It's not quite buried, but you can see from the picture on the right here that it's covered, especially the brass. So the orchestra can't be seen. The sound just sort of arises out of nothing. It also is good for balance, by the way. Something to consider when you see Wagner performed in a house like the Metropolitan Opera, where the pit is completely wide open and the sound is going straight up and out. So this is the theater. Wagner imagines this theater is the only place that his music will be performed, or his later music dramas will be performed, and he stipulates that his opera Parsifal cannot be performed anywhere else. So, of course, it was designed, especially designed for his huge cycle of 4 operas called The Ring of the Nibelungen. Now, you've certainly heard of The Ring. If you haven't, you've probably heard of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is inspired by, draws from a similar idea, but that was written after Wagner. The Ring cycle is far too much to even really get into, but I've given you some other readings and some listenings and some funny commentary by Anna Russell. Frankly, you could have an entire course easily. You could have 2 courses on Wagner's Ring cycle. Just to summarize it, goes back to medieval Northern European legends, combines 2 of them. He originally wanted to write 1 opera, the final one, and realized that the story was so complex that you really didn't understand it fully until you got into the backstories. And so he takes these long medieval sagas and epics and combines them, and he's got an enormously long 15-hour series of 4 operas, and he's got to build a theater, and so one has to come essentially and spend a vacation week. It's comparable, frankly, to Holy Week in Christianity, the amount of time and energy you have to devote to attending the Ring cycle. Wagner essentially demands that you worship is not an overstatement. Now, as egomaniacal as the whole endeavor is, it's also full of some remarkably beautiful music, and it's difficult to exaggerate the influence that Wagner's uh, Ring Cycle and his whole later work had on opera after him. Spend really do yourself a favor and listen to this wonderful Wotan's Farewell. It's my favorite part of the Ring. I think it's the high point for me and a lot of people of the Ring, and it's also probably the most beautiful use of the leitmotifs. I lay out all the ones that are important for you here and describe them to some degree. Listen for them, but what's most important here, and Wagner, by the way, never labeled any of these. He never described exactly what he was doing. He just did it and he let other people figure it out. But what's so beautiful about this scene is I know of no other more touching expression of love from a parent to a child in opera than Wotan's farewell to his daughter, Brunhilde. So enjoy that. Wagner but did not live many more years. His last opera was Parsifal. He died in Venice. Rather ironic since he was so German in spirit and spent so much of his time in Germany. But he had spent some time in Venice in his later years for health reasons. And he spent the winters there, and that's why he died there. He was brought back and buried in Bayreuth. You can go make a pilgrimage and see his tomb. Wagner, you can love him or you can hate him. You cannot ignore him. His life and work and his ideas, good and bad, were deeply influential and tell you a lot about Germany in the 19th century and Europe in general in the 19th century. Also the good and the bad, particularly the anti-Semitism.